Thank you. And which provisions of SB 7 do you consider the most important? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Would you mind going over how SB 7 would affect Latinos, African Americans, women, and seniors?
Yeah, so the stuff I talked about earlier about the drive-through voting, ending that, and extended hours voting, as I mentioned, our data shows that non-white populations use those forms of voting disproportionately, and so getting rid of those would be a substantial harm to those communities accessing the ballot. There's also the last version of SB 7, again, snuck in the middle of the night, would have prohibited early voting on Sundays before 1 p.m., which to us was an obvious attack on what's known as souls to the polls, which is a tradition in the African American community to go to the polls in conjunction with Sunday morning church services. Absurdly, the proponents of the bill said later, oh, that was a typo. It should have said 11 a.m., not 1 p.m., that they forgot to put a 1 there. Of course, it also said p.m., not a.m., so take that for what it's worth. A provision that we have not yet had a chance to mention was that in the earlier versions of SB 7, and we sort of expect this to possibly happen again, was a racist change to the formula for distributing county-wide polling places in counties. So the proposal basically would have tied the number of polling places in a county to the proportion of, at first, registered voters in state representative districts. And then later it was changed to the proportion of eligible voters in the state representative districts in the county. Now, that was complicated, but essentially, when you tie polling places to the number of registered voters in a particular area, our voter registration system is still infected with historic inequities, inequities in the past, but also the inequities that continue. And so the registered voter population in much of Texas is much wider than the eligible voter pool because of those historic barriers to voting. And we actually did a lot of damage to them by pointing this out. They changed it to eligible voters, but Kenneth, as you kind of mentioned, eligible voters, that's not really an easy number to determine because the number of eligible voters in any location literally changes day to day as people turn 18, people move in and out, people die. And so what probably would happen under that is that they would default to the registered voter formula. So that's all to say that this provision on countywide polling places and where they're supposed to go would have had an enormous impact by basically closing polling places in minority communities and redistributing them into white communities. On the disabled community front, I've kind of mentioned the changes to curbside voting that would have happened in voter assistance, which often impacts those populations. One that I hadn't mentioned yet is that in the very first version of SB 7, if you are a voter with disability trying to vote by mail on the ground of that disability, you would have had to provide evidence of your disability. You would have had to prove to the county and the state that you were disabled before you got a vote by mail ballot. That was removed before the bill hit a key vote, but these provisions never really die, and so we may see that again in the special session.